Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me and inviting me to talk to you. I'm really excited to be able to do this virtually, and today to get to talk to you about elevating egg quality, focusing from the pullet, and how this can really drive you throughout the laying period. And throughout my talk, I really want to get you to start thinking about making the shift. A lot of the times we think about the pullet as this cost center in the sense, but really we should start thinking about it in terms of the investment. The pullet really helps to set up the time for the laying hen for when she starts laying her eggs and maintains laying her eggs over time. So we're going to talk about how we can work on shifting this type of thinking and building up that oviduct structure, or how she's building her reproductive tract and how that ends up leading to the eggshell and maintaining that eggshell structure and strength over the life or the long life of the laying hen, and ultimately what influences this longevity in terms of her laying the eggs as well as the eggshell quality and being able to maintain that over a longer amount of time. So when we think about the overall life of a hen, we kind of think about it in two stages. First, we have the pullet stage. I did 0 to about 19 weeks. It really depends on when you're moving the birds. So here, for example, within Canada, we're moving them in and around 19 weeks. Other places would move them slightly earlier. Um, and then you go from sort of that young bird stage into the mature hen stage. When we're thinking about that young bird or that pullet, we're really thinking about the growth of her important structures so that we can get her set up properly so that she can lay her eggs and lay her eggs for a longer amount of time. And part of that setting up relates to things like making sure she's well protected. This could be a time where we have increased vaccinations and really focusing in on the bird weight to help sort of get that frame or set her up for that longer time. And I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. The other piece also to take into consideration just for the overall life of the bird is, especially when you're thinking about the timing and what are different things that can create stresses on the bird. You know, birds are creatures of habit. They don't like things to change too much. So one of the times of stress could also be the time when you're moving that pullet from the pullet barn over into the layer barn if you end up doing that move, because that is a shift in terms of where she is and what it is that she's doing. So you want to make sure you're preparing her and investing in her in the pullet stage to help with that stress time, and then ultimately also to help with that longevity over time. So thinking about what exactly is happening in those sort of first 19 plus some odd weeks when she is in the pullet stage. And this might be a bit of a busier graph, but I tried to kind of color code and set it out for you. So what you as a farmer sees, or what we see when we're in the barns, is ultimately we're just looking at the pullet's body weight. Um, Looking at the development of structure and being able to see it with our eyes is really difficult unless we're truly opening up the birds. So how we can start seeing the growth of some of these things is relating back to the body weight growth. But what we have to keep in mind is thinking about over the weeks of age that we have here, what are some of the organs or structures growing within the bird that's going to help set her up for that longevity of production. So we think within the first 6 weeks, we're building the bird's building the gastrointestinal tract and the immune system. Within about the first 15, we're really starting to get into the skeleton muscle and the bone, or the cortical bone, or the frame. And then moving out onwards, sort of 12, 14 weeks onward, this is really where you're starting to build into that reproductive tract and getting that bird closer and closer to starting to lay that egg and that preparation. So when we think about the pullet of an investment and we're thinking about what we can see or what we can manage, because you can't necessarily change how structures are forming, but you can certainly manage body weight. So the goal of this stage and building up that pullet is maintaining that uniform body weight for when she's ready to move to the layer barn or ready to go into egg production. And the idea here is that if you have that uniform body weight, you're going to start getting into uniform production, or they'll all start laying the eggs at a similar time when you start turning the lights on with photostimulation. But there's some things and some reasons why you need to work on getting that body weight. So first off, again, kind of coming back to the gastrointestinal system, what are some of the structures that are going to be important to set up that bird well? So we think about the gastrointestinal tract and the immune system. For the gastrointestinal tract, this is really going to help the bird with digestion, breaking down those nutrients, absorbing those nutrients so she can ultimately work on translating it into kilos of eggs or into her body structure to set her up for that long life of the bird. From the immune system side, this is really helping her with protection for her local within the gastrointestinal tract, and systemic immunity becomes really important when there's a lot of viruses or bacteria going around, various different challenges that ultimately you always end up seeing in the field. And the last piece in this part is really building up within the digestive tract the microbial diversity. And this helps with both another local protection, but it's also going to help with some extra nutrients that the bird may be able to get from those microbes that are there. So this really helps to set the bird up right, because if she's breaking down and then absorbing those nutrients, that's giving her the base to be able to build all of her structures with that, and then ultimately help with the long life of the bird. Then we come into the skeleton and muscle, really important. The cortical bone, again, building out that body frame and giving that physical protection of the bird. So from the body frame, it's setting her up to be able to put the muscle on, the fat on the way we want to, so that you can have those reserves being built to help with egg production over the longer time. From the muscle, depending on how those birds are raised, whether they're on a floor, in aviary systems, even to some extent within different conventional or enriched systems, it's helping to give her the wing or the leg power if she needs to move around, and again, building some of those protein and energy reserves. And then the last part is having that medullary bone, or setting her up so that she has calcium reserves. Now, granted, when she's going into lay and into that long life, you're not necessarily wanting her to pull the calcium from her bone. You want her certainly to get it from the feed, but this does help in terms of just having that reserve. And last but not least, helping to build the fat, which is going to help with building that steady energy supply. Again, not to ask the bird to take it from her own body, because obviously we're doing that with feed. We're providing the right energy, protein, calcium, and minerals within the feed. But if you come into those challenge times, any type of stress, which again is so common when we're coming into the field, having these reserves becomes really important, because we can feed to a certain amount, but sometimes getting that quick reaction in the diet versus what's actually happening in the field, you don't always have that connection. So I keep talking about this word uniformity. How do you actually measure it? And what does it mean? So here I just have a picture of a graph. So on the bottom, you're thinking of body weight increasing over time. Over here, we have the number of birds. And essentially what I'm showing here is a bell curve. So we start thinking about all of the birds that we could possibly have in the barn. And ideally, we're thinking about uniformity or sort of a similar body weight for 80 to 85% of the birds, give or take. Now, granted, it's, you're going to have plus 10% a bit above, minus 10% a bit below, and then the birds on either side that are either going to be too light, which would have lower performance, or too heavy, which would have also lower performance, and both would have impacts over the long life of the bird. But if we're keeping sort of 80, 85% plus uniform within a similar weight, then that means as we start coming into lighting those birds, getting ready for egg production, they can all come into production at a similar time, which then helps for consistency at the start of egg production, and also helps for maintaining the weight and the egg size over the longer time, and thinking about the strength of those eggs over the longer time within the lay period. So then what happens, as much as we try and achieve the ideal, which is the 88 to 85% plus in uniformity, in reality, sometimes that doesn't always happen. So we have to think about, well, what happens if there's potential for low uniformity? And the question here is, who are you actually feeding for? What size birds are you going to be feeding for here? Because a bird who's on the too low or too light end of the spectrum would have slightly different needs compared to birds that are a bit too heavy. So here's another example, same graph that's going on here, but the number of birds in sort of each weight category is different. But if we were just looking at the average, you have a big number, a medium number, and a small number. It all sort of comes out on average to look similar to that 80 to 85%. But in reality, when we're looking at this, there's quite a wide variation here, or sorry, the average weight seems to be similar to the average weight over here. There's a wide variation. So you're not getting that close uniformity that you're looking for, which means you have a good number of birds that are too heavy. And then you also have a good number of birds that are going to be too light. And you're trying to manage, okay, how can I feed these birds? So if you're thinking about bringing this type of flock into production, either they're not going to be, the egg numbers may seem to be a bit lower at the beginning. They're not all coming into lay at a similar time. And then trying to maintain size over time may be a bit challenging because you may be too much for those heavy or too big for those heavy birds, but still trying to get those smaller birds to catch up. So you know why we need to work on uniformity, what uniformity is, but how do we actually do it? So here's a couple of tips to be able to monitor the weight of the birds. It's really important to begin early, so starting at that 1 week of age. Obviously, the birds are really small at the beginning, so it's difficult to do individual weights. So at this point, you can pick a random sample and bulk weigh those birds weekly. Then afterwards, as the birds start getting bigger, you can do consistent random sets of birds weekly. Here it's about 100. Obviously, the more birds you're able to look at, the better. It just gives you better numbers. But you also have to think about how is this actually going to work in reality in your system with what you have. So these numbers are just guidelines. By no, you have to think about what's going to work with what you have. And it's important even after those 32 weeks as she's, getting closer or within peak, give or take, really to start thinking about those weights because that's going to help with managing the egg size. So when I talk about picking a random group of birds, what do I mean by that? If you're in more of those conventional or enriched systems, those mesh systems here, and you have control over sort of the specific unit of birds that you can go to. There you can randomly mark different locations to weigh, and you're constantly weighing those same locations from many different areas within the barn, many different tiers within the barn, so you can get that good random sample of what all around the barn looks like. For alternative systems, so ones where the birds are on the floor or potentially in aviary systems, you can't really mark a unit or a space. So now it's important just to grab birds from many different locations and then get a good number of birds so you can get a good weight. Here's just a couple of examples of target weights to think about during development, but really these target weights are going to vary depending on the breed and the status of the bird. So how much challenge is this bird going through? So keep that in mind. Again, they're guidelines, but by no means exact. And if you want to get more information, please feel free to use your phone. Check out this QR code. It's a great technical bulletin that was put out by Highline. And thinking more about sort of what body weight at first egg influences, so how uniform and how heavy that bird is, can have an impact on the egg weight, feed intake, as well as the egg production curve, especially if she starts coming into lay a bit too light. So it is okay to slightly exceed that body weight standard to build those body weight reserves just before she's going into the production of lay. So we have, you have to measure your body weight. You have to think about it during the pullet stage. You're really trying to maintain uniformity. But I keep mentioning some of these different challenges because ultimately in the field, there's always something that can happen. Again, those birds are creatures of habit, so the wind can blow a little differently and you run into something. So what are different ways to help with managing the body weight and supporting those birds? I always think about in English, we we have this acronym or this, different letters to be able to remind us of things. So we call it FLAWS. And if you really extend it out, it's feed, light, litter, air, water, space, sanitation, security, as in biosecurity, vaccines, and staff. And when you're thinking about going through your systems, think about all of these different pieces because all of them are certainly going to have an impact on that pullet stage and also certainly an impact on the layer stage. So just to highlight a couple, when we think about feed and water, thinking about things like the quality of that feed, the quality of the water, but also access. Can the birds physically get to it? Is it form that they're liking? So here in these pictures, we just have, or I just have an example of mash feed, making sure it's the right kind of mix of fines and larger particles. And here it's just getting the actual access. All of the birds have access to be able to get to the feed. Versus the water side, here are a couple of things where the birds need to have access, but you don't want drips. You want to have good quality. You don't want the biofilms building up. And it's not just about the water lines in the barns or the nipple drinkers in the barns. It's also about the anteroom or where you're putting in things like medication prior to going in. If there's a lot of dust and build up there, that's going to bring a lot of challenge, but we may not necessarily think about it. The other part is in terms of the space, especially setting up during that brood stage before those birds come in. What exactly is happening? What's going on? How are you starting when it comes into weighing? The start of production doesn't happen when the birds are physically in the barn. It happens much before when you start thinking about things like clean out, disinfecting, setting it up, and all that. So now when we come to the oviduct structure, how exactly is this set up? You kind of go from the ovary where you're releasing the yolk. You then go into the infundibulum where you're starting the formation of the inside of the egg. You have a magnum, the egg whites being produced. Then you come into the the isthmus, where you have inner and outer shell membranes being formed, and then the tubular shell gland where water is entering that egg white, and then the shell gland pouch. So this is where you're getting the eggshell being formed, and last but not least, pigmentation or the coloring going on, and then the cloaca where the egg's coming out the back end. In terms of the inner and outer shell membranes, this is really building the base or the structure for the eggshell to come on. So when we think about some of the things that can have an impact, especially as that bird is growing, disease can impact the lining. It can impair either the internal egg or the shell development. If it's happening in a young bird, this may impair just the growth of the oviduct in general, so that by the time you end up getting into lay, she's not laying and you're thinking about why, or she's not laying as well as you would like. Stress over a longer period, again, can impact things like the shell gland pouch. You can have retained eggs. And even though the oviduct can recover, in older birds, this becomes a bit more challenging. And it also can depend on how she's set up when she's younger. And then the location of where this type of disease or challenge is potentially impacting will matter in terms of how that eggshell structure is being impacted. So when we think about eggshell composition, it's more than just calcium and carbonate. You also have that organic matrix or that inner and outer shell membrane. This is really going to influence how that calcium carbonate is being laid onto the egg. So I find often we think about the bird as an assembly worker, so to speak. Every bird is going to be laying eggs in the exact same way, and we're going to get those eggs if we prepare her well in the pullet stage and we get her into the layer stage. But really, each bird, to some extent, is an artist in the sense that how they're laying the egg is going to be different, and it's going to be impacted by how each bird goes through that pullet stage and then builds over time into the layer stage. So when we look at sort of shifting a little bit towards the layer piece, when you look at the strength of the shell, where exactly is it coming from? So if we take a much closer look at the shell here, it's going to form from the bottom up. So specifically, we can look at the shell membrane. So again, that organic membrane, this is helping to form the organic matrix, or the base of the shell. Then we come into the mammillary layer. Essentially, this is just the building blocks of the shell, which is the contact point for calcification, how the calcium is going to attach to the shell membranes, build up strength with the palisade layer, and ultimately we have the cuticle at the very top, in terms of providing that protection for the egg. So I always think about the egg as a roof, and how a roof is being built. For example, you think of the bottom or the structure being those shell membranes. You have the next piece, sort of that wood covering, sort of where that calcium is being laid, but then you also need your thickness and your protection, and especially the shingles near the top, being the protection from the outer environment. And so then when we think about the roof quality, this really will change depending on the builder and the materials. So the state of the reproductive tract and the access to materials needed to build the egg really can change. And we have to understand that these sections will deteriorate with age, and stress and ability to use the nutrients. So in terms of overall health, and gut health, these types of things can have a factor to really impact the egg quality, but also how that bird is laying the egg over the longer amount of time. So building this up in the pullet stage is really important, and maintaining it over the length or the life of the hen. So how exactly does the gut translate nutrients and change this into kilos of egg at the end of the day? So and when we think about it from the pullet stage, how can she translate those nutrients into building her body weight and building that protection? So you have the crop. This helps with storage and minor feed breakdown. You start really getting into it in the proventriculus, the acid and enzyme feed breakdown. The gizzard, that's that physical breakdown. It's acting almost like the teeth of the bird. So if you're running into stress in any of these places, whether it's disease or something else that's having an impact, this is going to impact how the bird can start breaking down the nutrients, which will have downplays in terms of how she ends up being able to absorb it, because they're not broken down well enough. Then we come to the upper gut. This is really where you're getting digestion and absorption of fat, calcium, and most of our minerals and vitamins, and some protein. So when you think about it in terms of how she's from a pullet stage, getting her calcium to help build her bones or her frame and reserve, and then from the layer stage, how that ends up building the egg. The midgut, again, this is really going to help with things like the feed conversion piece, where you're really getting that protein, fat, and carbs, and some minerals being absorbed. And then you have the lower gut, where you're going to have the absorption of fat and water. And even though you have microbial diversity all throughout the intestinal tract, it really becomes important, especially in those ceca, where you're getting much more of that water absorption and bacterial fermentation or breakdown. So when you think about all of these other places, you can have, again, similar to the oviduct, depending on where that stress is happening, is going to impact how that bird is absorbing the nutrients. And then in the pullet, you end up seeing it as, okay, the uniformity's down, you're not getting calcium reserves, so maybe weak bones, having an impact on protection, versus overall longevity and life of the hen, have increased cracks and dirty eggs. So it becomes really important to think about holistic gut health management and different supporting programs that are there. and it's never going to be a start to finish, or it's never going to be a silver bullet, and it has to be a start to finish program. So 80% is going to relate back to things like feed management, water management, thinking about what's happening on the farm, and 20% is going to be within that additive program. But when thinking about the additives or the supplements, the things that you can add on, you have to think about what is your goal? What is the challenge that's happening at the time? What can you sit and think about fixing and improving? And how does that product work? And then ultimately, depending on what your goal and your challenges are, selecting the right one that's going to work in your situation. So the last part that I want to talk about, or the last section, is thinking about longevity of the bird, and especially relating that back to egg quality in terms of getting that production and getting that strength over time. So this is where you really start thinking about the minerals the bird is taking in, and as well as some of the vitamins. So again, thinking about calcium being an important part when we think about bone development in the pullet, as well as egg production, how that bird is absorbing that nutrient becomes important. So calcium can be absorbed in two ways. One, which is transcellular. Essentially, this is this active movement throughout the cell. Think of that person swimming. They're putting out energy. So there has to be energy to be able to absorb this. And then you have to have vitamin D3 to be able to help out as well. Then there's this passive diffusion or passive absorption, which is working on concentration gradients. This is the person sitting in an inner tube, just sort of casually going down. That's how the calcium's being absorbed. So there's two ways of this happening. And phosphorus can have balances calcium absorption. So when you're thinking about how it's being given to the bird, the particle size and when it is given matters when you're thinking about it in terms of egg production, because she's forming that shell towards the evening. In terms of sort of building up that bone of the bird, it's not necessarily the time of day per se, especially during the pullet period, but just making sure she's getting the right amount of calcium during her those important production stages. And if you have some type of gut health challenge that's going on, how is this going to end up impacting how calcium is being absorbed, and thinking about that bone and eggshell development? When it comes to the egg specifically, it's more than just the calcium that's there. It's also the carbonate that's important. And the intention is for you not to sit back and go and memorize this slide, because it's a very difficult one. It's just thinking about how calcium is being balanced and absorbed, and where carbonate is coming in. So carbonate comes from, you can get it from dietary bicarbonate going through the digestive tract. You can also get it from atmospheric, or basically as the bird's breathing in and out carbon dioxide. And then you also have the carbon dioxide that the bird is actually making, which is sort of helping to get rid of the waste within the kidney. And we also have to remember sort of that creation of the calcium carbonate that ends up getting on the egg is also zinc dependent. So there's other minerals that are important. So there can be many different things that impact respiratory and metabolic carbonate formation, sort of thinking about the acid base balance. So when you're thinking about the birds, if they're getting too hot, you get a lot of breathing out of carbon dioxide. So this can, and the panting, that can have an impact. So rethinking about, okay, if we're getting in too hot, what is this happening? Thinking about other things that could impact the breathing, ammonia environment as well. And then getting into some cases for how that bird can get rid of its waste. Are we giving it too much in terms of crude protein, and what's going on that way? And then the other part, thinking through sort of that zinc dependent, there's also a role of microminerals. So microminerals are important, and these are things like the selenium, zinc, copper, manganese, all throughout the production phase of the bird. So from pullet stage all towards the end of production into lay period, the lay period. So supporting the reproductive development, immune support, helping with bone development, more so if you're thinking about it with roosters on the breeder side of things, and then within the hen in terms of the lay period, helping with eggshell quality, but also the cells and integrity of the reproductive tract. And then on the egg or within the egg itself, helping with the strength or building that organic matrix, that inner and outer shell membrane, where the calcium can be laid on becomes also important. So a lot of the minerals that we end up using end up being inorganic trace minerals. They're cheap, they're easy access, and it's been used for a long time. But the challenge here is, especially when we start going into higher and higher calcium diets, calcium can actually bind other trace minerals, and these trace minerals are not quite stable. So what has happened is that we say, okay, well, we need increased levels of one particular trace mineral. This increases level needs of other trace minerals, and then all of a sudden you have a lot that's going into the bird that you're not using all of, and it's not being absorbed very well, so it's coming out the back end. So an alternative to this that's being used is organic trace minerals, or in this case, you have protonated trace minerals. So in terms of like zinc, copper, manganese, iron, what's happening here is we're replicating the plant material forms in the manufacturing process. And then with selenium, it's a little bit different. And we're essentially, with a selenium enriched yeast, we're getting the plant to take up more of the mineral. In both of these cases, there's many different forms that are on the market, but you have many differences in terms of the types of structure, bond strength, or in the case of yeast, the sources, the strains, and so on. Why these are important is because they're replicating or actually making the plant take up more of the mineral. It's helping with bioavailability and stability, so you can get that transport across the gut, which means you actually need less to still be able to achieve more. And it helps to deliver the mineral to the site of absorption. So this can either be added on top as a supplement or total replacement. And just as an example for how this works within the gut, here you have the lumen, so basically where the feed is coming in, and you have the salt form of the mineral. So here you have the salt form of the mineral, so in this case it's zinc. When you put a salt in water, what happens? It basically breaks down into its two different components. You have the salt and then the positively charged zinc. But the thing is positively charged things can be really negatively reactive within the body. So the body is trying to protect itself, and the mucus layer within the gut is negatively charged. So just like magnets, if you have a positive and a negative charge, they attach to each other, which means that some of the mineral gets to where it needs to go, but not all of it. So when we think about protonated trace minerals, for example, so things like Bioplex zinc, what's happening here, again, you still have the mineral coming in through the lumen with the feed, but instead, because it's bound with strength, when it goes through the water layer, instead of breaking down into its different components, and potentially, and because it's able to camouflage that positive charge, you end up getting all of it sort of to where it ultimately needs to go within the intestinal tract, which means you're able to use more with less. So coming back in terms of sort of that hen and building her up to have good egg production and then strength of egg production over time, what we found is using these bioavailable organic trace minerals or those bioplexes and cellplex helps to strengthen the attachment to the base of the pillar, so helping build that organic matrix. And now you're having that helping with the early connection of the calcium being formed. So again, when we think about the egg almost like a roof, we have to remember that roof quality really changes depending on the builder and the materials. And this truly is important. So we have sort of different pieces of nutrition that can impact, but how do we actually look at eggshell strength, especially as birds are starting to be moved? You know, we've done all that we can within the pullet stage. Now she's starting to lay the egg, and we're trying to maintain that longevity of egg production and quality within the layer barn. So there's a couple of different ways that you can test eggshell strength. One of the simplest, especially when you're bringing it to the barn in the environment, is going to be candling, essentially using flashlight and putting it under the egg to see, okay, is everything opaque? I'm not seeing any sort of light color areas, then I'm getting good quality, versus here it's more of a mottled, or you see more of light colored areas. Okay, this is more thin shell versus somewhere you could potentially see cracks, but you may not see it if you're just holding it in your hand. So being able to measure this and sort of have a scoring system can help going, okay, maybe there's other things that need to be addressed, help with that troubleshooting. There's other machines out there in terms of looking at eggshell strength, or those all-in-one machines that look at both internal and external eggshell quality. Certainly more of a cost when you're looking at this, but something, if you're thinking about, okay, maybe there's a way of doing this consistently, but not on every possible egg, only on a set number of eggs, just to keep in check what's happening. But again, you'd have to have a sort of a set bench space for this. So all of that to kind of come back to, what do you actually need to think about and take home from this? I think there's three main areas. One, we really have to think about the pullets as our investment for that long-term layer. And how we get that investment is multifaceted in terms of nutrition, management, health, environment, all of those different pieces. And we can really use the pullet body weight uniformity as an indicator for how that pullet is doing. Really maintaining or working on maintaining the gut health, because that's going to help with nutrient breakdown as well as absorption, and also the protection of the bird if there's different challenges that come across. And when we think about sort of how she comes into getting to her eggs and being able to produce, you really are building the reserves in the pullet. And we have to think that it's going to be more than just calcium that's important when it comes to egg production. So we always have the hope that the pullet we prepare is going to be ready and set us off well for the long life of that hen. But I think what ends up happening in reality is we have to work together in order to be able to observe what we're seeing within the birds, communicate what's happening, because for the person walking through the barn, they're going to be seeing things that are going on that perhaps someone who's helping you in terms of management from the nutrition veterinary stage may not be seeing, because they're not there constantly. So being able to have this communication is extremely important. So with that, I really just want to say thank you very much for listening, taking in this information, and having me here. Please reach out, and I also put up this QR code for a great egg quality poster just to look at and use that information. So thank you again, and again, I urge you to think about moving those pullets instead of just being a cost, but move them to think about them as an investment.